The Sopwith Camel shot down more enemy aircraft than any other fighter of the First World War. It also killed as many of its own pilots as it did Germans. Both of those facts trace to one source: a French engine. Pierre Clerget was a French engineer who designed rotary aero engines for the French firm Clerget-Blin et Compagnie. His Clerget 9B, an air-cooled rotary producing 130 horsepower, powered the vast majority of frontline Sopwith Camels throughout the war. When Camel pilots were credited with destroying 1,294 enemy aircraft, the highest tally of any Allied fighter type, the vast majority of those kills were achieved behind Clerget's engine. When 385 Camel pilots died in non-combat accidents, the overwhelming majority during training, killed not by enemy fire but by the aeroplane itself, they died because of the gyroscopic forces that same French engine generated. Britain designed the airframe at Sopwith's Kingston-upon-Thames works. Britain assigned the squadrons, flew the sorties, counted the victories. France built the engine that defined everything the Camel was: its agility, its lethality, its toll on both sides of the front line. The physics that made right-hand turns lethal, the French engineering Britain has spent a century writing out of the record. The forgotten Canadian who tamed this beast to score 54 confirmed kills. All of it starts with Pierre Clerget's spinning cylinders. Entire documentaries have been produced about the Sopwith Camel without once mentioning the word Clerget. The word French never surfaces. Popular British aviation history carries a deep reluctance to acknowledge how completely the Royal Flying Corps depended on French-designed power plants, and the omission is consistent enough to constitute a pattern. The Clerget 9B was French. The Lerone 9J, fitted to some Camel variants, was also French. Only later production batches received the British-designed Bentley BR1. For the bulk of the Camel's operational career, the engine came from France, and the Royal Flying Corps' dependency on French-designed power plants extended well beyond a single aircraft type. One historically literate observer, writing after watching a recent shallow documentary about the Camel, put it plainly: Britain certainly played her part, but the French were the military/economic powerhouse of the Allies in World War I. The Camel's celebrated kill record was compiled by British and Commonwealth pilots, flying a British airframe powered by French engineering, in French skies, above French ground. Remove France from that equation, and the story isn't simplified, it's falsified. French dominance in aero-engine design wasn't incidental to the Allied war effort, it was structural. Pierre Clerget's 9B, manufactured by Clerget-Blin et Compagnie, defined the character of Britain's most celebrated fighter. The RFC flew French-engined aeroplanes not because of preference, but because of dependency. When Herbert Smith at Sopwith drew up the Camel's airframe, he designed it around the characteristics of a French power plant. The airframe was the container. Clerget's engine was the soul of the machine. Understanding why that French engine was so consequential, why it simultaneously enabled the Camel's combat dominance and killed hundreds of student pilots who never saw the front, requires understanding what a rotary engine actually does, because it's emphatically different from the radial engine it superficially resembles. Both types arrange their cylinders in a star pattern around a central hub. Beyond that visual similarity, they share almost nothing. In a conventional engine, radial or otherwise, the crankshaft rotates while the engine block sits still, bolted firmly to the airframe. In Clerget's rotary, the arrangement inverts entirely. The crankshaft is fixed to the airframe. The entire engine block, all the cylinders, the crankcase, the reduction gearing, spins bodily with the propeller. Several hundred pounds of metal whirling at over 1,000 revolutions per minute, strapped to the nose of a small wooden aeroplane. Picture a massive spinning top bolted where the engine should be. That rotating mass generates gyroscopic forces completely separate from thrust or lift. They are pure Newtonian physics, enormous in magnitude, asymmetric in their effects, and lethal in their consequences for any pilot who didn't understand them. Gyroscopic precession is the specific phenomenon, and it operates on a principle that defies intuition. When a force is applied to a spinning gyroscope, the response doesn't occur in the direction of the applied force. It occurs 90 degrees later in the direction of rotation. Clerget's 9B rotated clockwise as seen from the cockpit. When a Camel pilot attempted a right-hand turn, applying right rudder and right stick, gyroscopic precession translated the turning force into a vicious nose-down pitching moment. The nose dropped hard. Airspeed surged. At low altitude, during takeoff, on a landing approach, in the first solo circuit of a student with perhaps 15 hours of total flying time, there was no margin left. The aeroplane went straight into the ground. Wood, doped linen, a fuel tank sitting behind a hot castor oil burning engine. The pilot burned. Left turns told a completely different story. Precession produced a nose-up tendency, pulling the aircraft into a tighter, climbing arc. For a pilot who had internalized what Clerget's spinning mass would do, who understood the asymmetry between left and right at the level of reflex rather than textbook theory, the left turn became a weapon of devastating effect. The Camel could snap left with a tightness and speed no German fighter could follow, hauling itself into a firing position before the enemy pilot had time to register the change in geometry. One period-literate commentator captured the dynamic with precision. A powerful rotary engine in a small airframe will inevitably make for a lively ride, especially if you are turning the right way. Right turn. The French engine tried to bury you. Left turn. The French engine made you deadly. Same machine, same power plant, same Newtonian physics. Whether the pilot lived or died depended entirely on whether anyone had taught him what Clerget's cylinders were doing beneath the cowling. Herbert Smith, Sopwith's chief designer, built the Camel's airframe specifically to exploit the characteristics of the French rotary engine. He concentrated virtually all of the aircraft's major masses, engine, fuel, guns, pilot, within the forward 7 feet of the fuselage. That deliberate clustering gave the Camel an extraordinarily short moment arm, enabling it to rotate around its axis faster than anything else in the sky. Brilliant engineering. But it functioned only because Clerget's engine at the nose provided both the power and the gyroscopic energy that made such concentrated agility meaningful. Without the French engine, the airframe was inert spruce and wire. With it, the Camel became either a precision killing instrument or a coffin. The distance between those two outcomes was thinner than in any other fighter of the war. Flying the Camel in combat demanded a pilot's entire nervous system. Smith's concentrated mass distribution placed the aircraft's center of gravity and its center of rotation nearly coincident, which gave experienced pilots an almost neurological connection to the machine. It responded to inputs as fast as thought. But that same design made the Camel persistently nose-heavy. Pilots had to maintain the engine at full power simply to hold level flight. In a dogfight, hauling through violent turns, scanning for threats, managing stick and rudder and blip switch all at once, a single moment of divided attention could allow the Camel to flick into an unrecoverable spin. Clerget's gyroscopic forces fed rotational energy into the spiral. accelerating it beyond anything opposite rudder could arrest. One glance over a shoulder to check a blind spot. That could be the last conscious act of a pilot's life. The name Camel was never an official Sopwith designation. Pilots coined it from the distinctive metal hump that fared over synchronized Vickers machine guns mounted on the fuselage ahead of the cockpit. Those guns sat close together under the fairing, and their geometry meant the fields of fire converged at a single devastating point ahead of the aircraft. At the murderously close ranges where Camel pilots engaged, both streams of bullets struck the same spot on the target, concentrating destructive energy rather than scattering it. A burst at close range could saw through the structural members of an albatross like a bandsaw through pine. Operational service began in the summer of 1917. Number 4 Squadron, RNAS, received the first Camels in June, with RFC squadrons following shortly after. Timing mattered enormously. The Royal Flying Corps had just survived Bloody April 1917, when losses compressed the average pilot's life expectancy at the front to roughly 17 days. Desperate for a machine that could match the German Albatros D3 Scouts, the Corps seized on the Camel. In experienced hands, Clerget's engine delivered. By war's end, Camel pilots were credited with 1,294 enemy aircraft destroyed, more than any other Allied type. That figure has been repeated in virtually every account of the Camel for a century. It has never received the scrutiny it warrants. RFC and RAF victory claims were compiled through a system that was, at its most charitable, imprecise. A claim typically required a witness, another pilot, or a ground observer, but in the chaos of multi-aircraft dogfights at 15,000 feet, accurate observation was effectively impossible. Pilots claimed in good faith aircraft they damaged but not destroyed, or sent spinning earthward, only to recover at lower altitude beyond anyone's sight. Shared kills were counted by multiple claimants. German loss records, where they survive for cross-referencing, consistently show lower figures than corresponding British claims for the same engagements. Every combatant air service overclaimed. The German Jagdstaffeln were no exception. But the tendency was particularly acute in the British system, which lacked the rigorous confirmation requirements employed by the French. The Camel's specific 1,294 should be understood as the product of a wartime counting system that had every incentive toward institutional optimism and none toward rigor. The true count of enemy aircraft actually destroyed by Camels is almost certainly lower. How much lower is impossible to determine precisely from surviving records. What can be said is that the ratio most popular accounts imply, 1,294 enemy destroyed against 385 British and Commonwealth pilots killed in training, flatters the institution that kept the count. Those 385 are where France's erased contribution cuts deepest. Of the roughly 5,490 Camels built during the war, 798 pilots died flying them. 413 were killed in combat operations. 385 perished in non-combat accidents, the overwhelming majority during training. Those 385 men died because of the physics of a French engine that their instruction had never adequately explained. Not one was shot at. Not one crossed the Channel. Their war ended on aerodromes across England, Scotland, and Egypt, burning doped fabric, hot castor oil, wreckage tangled in the grass of some training ground. Because the leap from a docile Avro 504 to a machine governed by Clerget's gyroscopic forces was like stepping from a rowing boat into whitewater rapids in darkness. Student pilots arriving at operational training units had as few as 15 or 20 hours in their logbooks, much of it accumulated on gentle types like the Avro 504 or the Maurice Farman Shorthorn. The Sopwith Pup, the Camel's direct predecessor, had been balanced and predictable, a machine that practically flew itself and that students loved for its forgiving nature. The Camel forgave nothing. Students had to simultaneously manage torque reaction on takeoff, the aeroplane swinging hard to the right as propeller torque fought the rudder, gyroscopic pitch and yaw coupling through every turn, and the blip switch that served as the only means of power control. Rotary engines had no conventional throttle. Pilots cut ignition to individual cylinders to reduce power, a technique demanding its own separate mastery, layered on top of everything else the Camel required. Official accident records attributed the resulting crashes to student pilots failing to simultaneously manage these demands. Institutional language for institutional negligence. Dual-control Camel trainers were eventually developed, and they were credited with reducing the accident rate at the schools that employed them. That passive voice acknowledgement tells its own story. The previous rate had been unacceptable, and the institution had known it. Those trainers arrived late. Never enough were built to meet the need. The training pipeline existed to replace losses at the front, and if men had to die in England to keep the machine fed, the arithmetic was accepted without ever being stated aloud. Squadrons consumed pilots. Aerodromes consumed students. Clerget's engine, never properly explained, spun at the centre of both consumptions. France's engine wasn't the flaw. Britain's failure to teach men what that engine would do, that was. The pilots who survived long enough to master Clerget's forces proved what the machine could achieve when French engineering met human skill. Two Canadians, both born in 1893, both effectively erased from popular memory, demonstrated what command of a French rotary engine looked like above the Western Front. Donald McLaren, born in Ottawa, Ontario, came to flying late in the war. He didn't record his first aerial victory until late 1917. What followed was relentless. Flying Camels with No. 46 Squadron RAF. McLaren compiled 54 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total achieved by any Camel pilot in the entire war. 54 kills behind Clerget's spinning cylinders, in an aeroplane that was killing student pilots at a rate approaching 1 per day across the training establishment. That number speaks to an understanding of the French engine's gyroscopic forces so thorough it operated at the level of muscle memory. McLaren knew exactly how far he could press a right turn before Procession dropped the nose toward a fatal dive. He knew how to weaponize the left, hauling the Camel into a climbing turn so tight that a pursuing German fighter overshot and found itself staring down Vickers barrels at point-blank range. The convergence of those closely mounted guns at short distance meant a single accurate burst could shatter an enemy machine's structural members, and McLaren proved adept at placing himself at precisely that lethal distance. He earned the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross with Bar, and the Distinguished Flying Cross, a weight of decoration reflecting sustained, extraordinary performance over months of combat. His name remains virtually unknown outside specialist circles. Mention a Great War fighter pilot to anyone on any street, and the answer is the Red Baron. Mention a Camel pilot, and you might hear Snoopy, the beagle Charles Schultz, first perched atop a red doghouse in 1965, who has done more for the Camel's public recognition than any actual pilot who flew one. Raymond Collishaw's path to mastery of French rotary engine physics began on a different Sopwith airframe, but the identical Clerget power plant. Born in Nanaimo, British Columbia, Collishaw joined the Royal Naval Air Service and by spring 1917 commanded B Flight of No. 10 Naval Squadron, equipped with Sopwith triplanes. Those triplanes were powered by the same Clerget 9B that would later define the Camel. The same French cylinders spinning at the same speed, generating the same gyroscopic forces, imposing the same lethal asymmetry between left and right. Collishaw's unit became the Black Flight, an all-Canadian formation whose aircraft bore names from a darker register: Black Maria, Black Death, Black Roger, Black Prince, Black Sheep. They savaged the German Jagdstaffeln with a ferocity that enemy pilots recorded and feared. Collishaw scored 34 of his eventual 60 total aerial victories on the triplane, a type virtually forgotten today, despite being so effective that its appearance over the front prompted the German military to issue an emergency requirement for a triplane fighter of their own. That program produced the Fokker Doctor 1, the aeroplane Richthofen made immortal. Everyone remembers the German triplane. Almost no one remembers the Canadian-flown, French-engined British triplane that panicked Germany into building it. After the triplane's withdrawal from frontline service, Collishaw moved to the Camel, carrying an intimate understanding of rotary engine behaviour forged in the triplane's cockpit. A master practitioner of French rotary physics, applying hard-won knowledge to a more heavily armed airframe. The training death statistics confirm what that experience meant. The Camel didn't systematically kill experienced rotary engine pilots. It killed novices. Young men given inadequate instruction, strapped into a machine that demanded expertise they'd never been permitted to acquire. McLaren and Collishaw survived and dominated because they understood what Pierre Clerget's engine would do. Hundreds of others died because nobody told them. Even mastery couldn't overcome what arrived over the Western Front in spring 1918. The Fokker D7 entered German service powered by a Mercedes D3 or the superb BMW 3A engine. Faster than the Camel at altitude, able to climb more steeply, a more stable gun platform, and, critically, far more forgiving to fly. The D7 represented a generational advance in fighter design. The armistice of November 1918 specifically required Germany to surrender all Fokker D7s, the only aircraft singled out by name in the treaty. That clause said more about the D7's capabilities than any historian's assessment ever could. Germany had moved to engine technology that imposed none of the gyroscopic penalties the French Rotary extracted from every Camel pilot on every sortie. The very characteristics that had given the Camel its lethal left turn, Clerget's greatest tactical gift, had become a liability against an opponent that didn't have to fight its own engine through every manoeuvre. By the war's closing months, the machine built around French rotary power was being outclassed by conventional engineering. The mythology has never absorbed this. One final institutional decision turns this story from engineering tragedy into something altogether darker. British High Command refused to issue parachutes to its fighter pilots. Parachutes existed, they worked. German balloon observers had been using parachutes since early in the war, and by 1918, German fighter pilots were beginning to receive the Heinecke parachute. In Britain, the Calthrop Guardian Angel parachute had been developed and tested successfully. The technology was proven, available, ready for deployment. British authorities rejected it. Their reasoning, institutional policy, not one officer's whim, held that providing parachutes would encourage pilots to abandon salvageable aircraft prematurely. The phrase, embedded in the historical record, carries a bureaucratic coldness that a century hasn't softened, eliminating the temptation to bail out. The aeroplane mattered more than the man inside it. Apply that policy to the Camel's most common fatal failure mode. A pilot whose machine entered an unrecoverable spin, Clerget's gyroscopic forces feeding rotational energy into the spiral faster than any control input could arrest, had seconds of awareness before the ground arrived. With a parachute, those seconds were enough. Unbuckle, climb out, jump. Without one, the pilot rode the machine down. At higher altitudes, the intervals stretched, long enough to understand with complete clarity that escape was impossible, long enough to watch the altimeter unwind, long enough to know what was coming and be unable to change it. The RFC became the RAF in April 1918. The name changed. The parachute policy didn't. Men continued to burn in spinning camels powered by a French engine whose gyroscopic behavior was known and understood. In machines whose specific lethality to undertrained pilots was documented in accident reports accumulating on desks across Whitehall. The institution knew the danger. It quantified the danger. It chose the aeroplane over the aviator. Every time. Right through to the armistice. Germany equipped its pilots with parachutes. Britain denied them to men flying the single most difficult aeroplane in Allied service. The one machine in the entire inventory most likely to enter an irrecoverable condition that only a parachute could survive. The men who needed parachutes most were the men least likely to receive them. Training school students in Camels, fighting Clerget's talk for the first or second or fifth time, went into the ground with a piece of proven life-saving equipment sitting in a warehouse somewhere because an official in London had decided that letting them live might cost the Crown an airframe. France designed and manufactured the engine at the heart of Britain's most celebrated Great War fighter. Pierre Clerget's spinning cylinders gave the Sopwith Camel its agility, its kill record, and the gyroscopic forces that killed 385 men on training aerodromes across England, Scotland, and Egypt. French engineering sat at the centre of every credited victory and every training death. British institutions compounded the danger of that powerful French engine through a training system that didn't teach men what it would do and a parachute policy that denied them any escape when they couldn't control what it did. A century of selective retelling then erased France from the narrative entirely, along with Donald Maclaren's 54 victories and Raymond Collishaw's 60, displaced from memory by a German baron and a cartoon beagle. The 385 who died on training aerodromes across England, Scotland, and Egypt were never in anyone's memory to begin with. A French engine defined the machine. British decisions killed the men who flew it. Canadian skill proved what mastery looked like. And the story most people hear includes none of this. Subscribe for more stories like this.